4 years on from the release of Star Wars Fallen Order, developer Respawn brings us an ambitious sequel in Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and it's a sequel with some real technical high points alongside, yes, some notable performance issues which we'll get to. Above all though, it's a sequel built just for newer PlayStation 5, Series X, S and PC hardware with no last-gen PS4 or Xbox One versions to speak of. And on paper anyway, this is the kind of current-gen focused development that we've been dying to see more of on PS5 and Series X. Lighting, shadows, animation quality are all standout, but the headline here is perhaps the inclusion of ray tracing on console and PC, including ray trace reflections and global illumination. Just walking around this opening city is a real showcase, a statement of intent from Respawn where the quality of Jedi Survivor's visuals impress hugely from the get-go. Today then, in the spotlight, we have the PlayStation 5 version. Alas, we didn't receive code from EA on either version and had to source PS5 ourselves. For Xbox, we bought it from the Xbox store on the day of release in fact, and so this does sadly mean we need more time to properly test Series X and to see what the situation is on Series S. So my colleague Oliver Mackenzie will be looping back with a full console comparison and tech breakdown of Jedi Survivor in due course, but for today, I figured it best to at least get some information out around launch. At least a little insight into how it runs on PS5, especially given the reports of its troubled performance. So just how does its 30fps resolution mode and 60fps performance mode compare in their visual makeup, focusing on PS5? What's the best way to play between the modes, and what's the state of the frame rate on each mode? Let's find out. Landing with a 150GB install, Jedi Survivor is a colossus endeavour from the team at Respawn. The cutscenes are gorgeously presented, and as with the original game, we get a mix of Metroidvania-style progression and Dark Souls-esque combat, where a sprawling world design is really at the heart of its appeal. From the glittering cityscape of the game's intro to the flourishing greenery of Koboh, the first truly explorable open area of the game, there's a great sense of variety here. In fact, it's in these first two areas, the city and the open plains of Koboh, that we see Unreal Engine 4 being pushed in two starkly different ways. To start with the city, this is a more linear, platforming heavy section, a guided tutorial essentially, with tighter environments where the dark interiors show select ray tracing features off on PS5. Now, since there's no specific ray tracing toggle on console, here's PC to show an example, ray tracing disabled on left and enabled on right. In demonstration, it's here we get a form of indirect lighting with ray tracing enabled, suggesting ray trace global illumination. Next up, jumping over to an open-ended area like Koboh, there's another surprise. Ray traced reflections are used for water bodies, like lakes and streams, which replace the usual screen space reflection method. The result? Well, there's no artifacting around objects blocking the reflections, as we'd get with SSR, none of those odd blank spots underneath the character's arms. The mirror image stays consistent, even if the world detail being reflected is out of your view, but there's a catch. I've noticed the regular old SSR technique, with all its limits, is still deployed in parts of the game on PS5, and therefore it does appear ray trace reflections are selectively used across Jedi Survivor as and when Respawn feels PS5 has the headroom to use them. But I will say where they do appear, the result is always impressive. There's much more to see of Jedi Survivor's ray tracing feature set, so this is just a taster. The point I'm getting to though, well, it must be said, for all the incredible visual features on show, the ray trace technologies, the incredible lighting, shadows, it all does come at a cost compared to the original game. Areas with heavy use of ray tracing in particular are a problem for PS5, so for almost the entirety of the opening city area, the frame rate drops down to around 45fps in the 60fps performance mode, and meanwhile, the resolution targets of Jedi Survivor also take a hit compared to the original game, just to make these new features possible. It's a trade-off. Before we get to that though, let's talk through the two modes on PS5 first, the 30fps resolution mode and the 60fps performance mode. Point number 1. Ray tracing is engaged for both modes on PS5. There's no way to opt out of certain ray tracing settings, in other words, and they're seemingly integral to Respawn's intended look for the game. For example, reflections in Kobo are ray traced on both sides, where even the 60fps performance mode keeps them in place. It's quite remarkable that Jedi Survivor doesn't compromise here in switching to SSR or something like that. Equally, the look of the darker city environments, the use of indirect lighting, are an exact match too, even when switching to the 60fps mode. And likewise, moving on, shadow quality, texture resolution, and volumetric effects all share the same preset for each mode on PS5. Fundamentally then, we're looking at the same visual makeup regardless of if you're playing at 60 or 30fps here. That is, with a few major exceptions. The first exception is resolution. To target 60fps, something has to give, obviously, and if it's not ray tracing, if it's not shadow quality, if it's not any of those settings, it then falls on the native resolution to adapt. So, to start with the 30fps resolution mode, which is the default mode, we have a dynamic resolution setup in place, adjusting based on rendering load. The target here is 4K, but gameplay typically renders at between 972p at worst and 1242p looking directly up at the sky. And then in cutscenes, it goes even higher to 2560 by 1440 at peak when looking at GPU light areas. So there's a range, and potential for it to go even higher. Either way, this base image is reconstructed with AMD's FSR2, using information from previous frames to create a high resolution result, and honestly, while it generally convinces, FSR2 suffers from quite obvious artifacts in motion. Fine details like these climbable metal grates lose definition, and at an angle they create this visual noise. Also, any character movement in the foreground often undoes FSR2's hard work behind it, for a few frames showing the raw base pixel structure. Image quality isn't Jedi Survivor's strong suit then. In fact, it's worth bearing in mind the last game, Star Wars Fallen Order, on PS5 ran at a higher resolution than this in its own 30fps mode, at between 1512p and 4K. The sequels dropped to a range of 972p and 1440p no doubt helps free up system resource for ray tracing features, and FSR2 does to some extent help clean up the image, but it's certainly not perfect. The game's rough edges do show. And more glaring still is the image quality of its 60fps performance mode. Here the menu states it's targeting 1440p, but the actual native resolutions in practice are much lower, between 648p and 864p for gameplay. Again, that's reconstructed using FSR2 to create a 1440p image, but yes, across a breadth of tests here, we're getting sub 720p native resolutions on PS5 in this mode. Notably, this is in the opening city where the frame rate truly struggles to hit 60fps. Now, as an aside, cutscenes do switch to a 30fps cap even in this mode, and so run at high resolutions similar to the resolution mode. That's the lowdown then. PS5, and I suspect Series X once we get to it, run with a stunning core visual feature set, but the cost to image quality is pretty dear, especially where the FSR2 doesn't keep up. Before we get to the frame rate testing though, there's one more difference between the modes worth mentioning, in that plant density is improved on the 30fps resolution mode. So trees not only render farther afield, but even up close they're more abundant. And likewise, I've noticed shadow draw is also improved while running at 30fps. Neither of these differences honestly affected my enjoyment in playing at 60fps, but it's worth bearing in mind. Otherwise, cutscenes are a complete match on both sides, as are interior area details, like around this PYLOON'S saloon area. The big question then, how does performance stack up? And which mode is the favoured way to play? Kicking off with the 30fps mode to start, it's obvious why this is left on by default. Not only do you get the higher base pixel counts, the improved foliage draw, but also performance is just that much more consistent at 30fps. Across the opening tutorial, it's a practical 30fps lock. There are a few occasional bouts of screen tearing in gameplay here, right at the top third of the display, but generally, it's a very solid turnout for this tutorial section. With all that said, perhaps the most jarring moments in the big city relate to the cutscenes, which occasionally drop closer to the 20 FPS line for brief spells. It's often in the transitions between scripted cutscenes and gameplay, as visual settings swap over behind the scenes, that you'll spot a hitch of some kind, or a flash. But as far as gameplay goes, early on at least, this is the mode to use. Moving to later areas, the more open-ended Kobo planet especially, this is where the 30 FPS mode shows some problems. The culprit is pretty easy to pick out too. Between the ray trace reflections and the water physics, we get hard drops on the outskirts of this village around this stream here. Areas with water bodies have frame rates lurch well into the 20 FPS region and even the teens, and yes, screen tearing flares up in concert. It's pretty hard to ignore, but again, it flies in the face of the generally solid performance elsewhere at 30 FPS for the dungeon missions and the later forest section. Of course, being 30 FPS, and if this is your chosen way to play, it does help to have a high quality motion blur, and I'm glad to say Jedi Survivor does have an optional blur toggle that's worth keeping on. The outlook for the resolution mode is mixed though. A solid start, but the potential for drops down to 15 FPS is certainly there. Switching over to the 60 FPS performance mode, it's almost a reverse situation here. So for example, the first city area starts well, briefly, but the further you play into it, the harder that frame rate line plummets. Down to 50 FPS, 45, and even into the 30s at points. And the most frustrating part, you get screen tearing at the top third of the display for the entire duration that it's dropping, which is obviously quite often through this whole city route. Now, in theory, a VRR capable display will help smooth over these variances up and down the graph, but even with that in place, expect some perceptible drops. Coupled with its low rendering resolution, this 60 FPS performance mode is a really tough sell, and just feels like it's lacking optimization. I'd argue, as a first impression of the game, with results like this within the first 30 minutes, it might be better to just stick with the 30 FPS cap. On to the good news, because performance at 60 FPS does actually improve later into the game, at least a little. Planets like Kobo, with more open-ended designs, lock to 60 FPS more often, and likewise, the dungeons, the bars tend to fare much better too. The trouble spots though are similar in nature to the 30 FPS mode, so water with ray trace reflections tend to tank performance quite hard, down to 45 FPS around the outskirts, but in general, the platforming side of gameplay here does genuinely get closer to the mark. Again, it doesn't feel particularly like an easy one to recommend though, with the tearing at the top of the screen, as well as the low base pixel counts, plus the FSR breakup. Of course, I'd love to see this mode get extra attention with later updates, and in fairness, Respawn has promised several patches are in the works. The situation here as it stands though, suggests a real uphill battle to lock at 60 FPS, especially if the team is determined to avoid dropping other settings. Even with this quick look at PS5, it's clear that Star Wars Jedi Survivor needs a lot more work. For all the huge promise in its visuals, the game still suffers from frame rate issues. There are visual bugs in animation, the collision, and I've even had a software crash on PS5. Again, there's obviously patch updates to come, but all of this does pose questions about the other versions. How does Xbox Series X, for example, stack up right now? And is the frame rate much the same as PS5's? Also, does Series S have an even remotely comparable feature set in supporting 60 FPS or ray tracing? All to be covered in the coming week, but for now, on PS5, Star Wars Jedi Survivor is one of the more fascinating releases we've had in a long time, for reasons both good and bad. There's just so much potential here, and I do hope we end up getting a more polished game, if only eventually, than what we're seeing here at launch. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, just use Twitter. But from me for now, thanks for watching.